Environmental Science, Chapter 18, Video 2, Waste Management in the Future. The commonly accepted approach to waste management treatment at present follows the waste management hierarchy: source reduction, reuse of products, recovery and recycling, waste treatment and incineration, and storage and disposal. That said, the most beneficial form of waste management is ultimately reducing consumption related to the precautionary principle, or taking anticipatory action in the absence of complete proof or harm. Remember that the precautionary principle or precautionary approach to risk management states that if an action or policy has a suspected risk of causing harm to the public or the environment, in the absence of scientific consensus that the action is harmful, the burden of proof that it is not harmful falls on those taking an action. In solid waste management, this is done through use of alternative materials and products, change of manufacturing procedures, and ultimately less consumption. As of 2005, about half, or 54%, of all municipal solid waste was sent to landfills or incinerated without energy recovery. 13.6% was combusted with energy recovery, and about 32% was recycled. Several categories of recycling can exist. In general, they're lumped into two main groups: the closed loop, which products retain the same use, such as glass and metal, and open loop, where new products are made from the old ones, such as paper and plastics. Over the last few decades, the generation, recycling, composting, and disposal of municipal solid waste have changed substantially. Solid waste generation per person per day peaked in 2000, while the 4.38 pounds per person per day is the lowest since the 1980s. 4.38 pounds generated per day is the lowest since the 1980s. The recycling rate has increased from less than 10% of MSW generated in 1980 to over 34% in 2010. Disposal of waste in landfills has decreased from 89% of the amount generated in 1980 to under 54% of MSW in 2010. Recycling rate has grown more slowly, though, over the last 5 years. We may be reaching plateau. Composting, the breakdown of organic waste by soil microorganisms, is generally underutilized in the United States. The approximate 25% of our municipal solid waste by weight that consists of yard and food waste could be composted to make humus or fertile topsoil. An additional 15 to 25% of waste, such as in the form of wood, paper, leather, textiles, and other biodegradable wastes, could also be readily converted to low-grade compost. Composting can occur on many different scales. When we talk about recycling, we talk about closing the loop. This means developing sustainable waste management that will require changing several aspects of society's interaction with materials. Recycling can be strengthened by extending the capacity for processing recyclables, strengthening the market for recyclables, and removing existing tax breaks and subsidies for the use of virgin materials. You can close the loop in industrial processes as well. Industrial waste systems can improve recycling by enhanced efficiency so that industrial process effluent can be used as raw material elsewhere in manufacturing, such as biodiesel from waste cooking oil, methanol from CO, and producing methanol from carbon monoxide and hydrogen waste. The end product and design process to facilitate material recovery can also facilitate this. One example is the move towards LED light bulbs, in which many are calling for a standardized use of part types and materials. This would allow the new industry to recycle many parts and reduce costs, which are 3 to 4 times of those for fluorescent or incandescent bulbs. Other examples include computer manufacturers such as Dell requiring producers of components to offer end-of-life recovery for products that they sell Dell. for the manufacturing process. Hazardous waste is different than MSW. Hazardous substances are defined by a different piece of legislation called the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, or CERCLA. And these are the wastes that, when released into the environment, present a substantial danger to the public health, welfare, or the environment itself. Hazardous waste often includes substances that are chemically reactive, corrosive, flammable, explosive, or toxic to living organisms. The Department of Transportation also defines hazardous substances for purposes of transport through the country, but most of them are defined by the EPA through CERCLA. Three major categories of hazardous waste are organic compounds, like those with a carbon backbone, inorganic components, like metals and ions, and radioactive waste. Hazardous waste is now considered a separate waste disposal issue and completely separate from municipal solid waste. When dealing with hazard waste, we can look to historical issues that brought these things to the public attention. Perhaps the most famous is the Love Canal, which is a classic example of a problem created by inadequate disposal of hazardous waste. In the 1890s, William T. Love, foreseeing an economic boom along the banks of the Niagara River, began excavating a canal. It would skirt past the Niagara Falls, allowing boats to travel between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. More importantly, the diverted water would be used to generate hydroelectric power. Drawn by a seemingly inexhaustible supply of energy, new industries would spring up. Workers would commute to modern factories from a showcase urban development he would call Model City. Love's plan depended in large part on the need for power-hungry customers to come to the electricity, in which in those days was generated only by direct current. Direct current could not be carried very far before it faded. But around the time Love's Canal broke ground, Nikola Tesla and his employer, George Westinghouse, introduced alternating current generators and transformers. Before long, electricity could be stepped up to high voltages and transported across the country. That and the Great Economic Panic of 1893 put an end to Love Canal project, leaving an unfinished ditch about 3,000 feet long and 100 feet wide. In the years around World War II, the Hooker Electrochemical Company acquired it for use as a dump, eventually disposing of some 22,000 tons of toxic waste, including carcinogens like benzene and dioxin. In 1953, the land, closed and covered with dirt, was given for a token payment of $1 to the local school board with the understanding that it was filled with chemical waste. An elementary school was built there anyway, and the city envisioned turning part of its old dump into a park. Land bordering the canal was sold and developed, and in the late 1970s, after a couple of years of unusually high precipitation, residents began to complain of a sickening smell. When an official from the Environmental Protection Agency came to inspect, he saw rusting barrels of waste that had found their way to the surface. Potholes were oozing waste into several backyards, and it had seeped into the basement of one home. Quote, "The odors penetrate your clothing and adhere to your footwear," he reported. 3 days later, his sweater still stank. The neighborhood was evacuated, a national emergency declared, and the investigation began. People living along Love Canal had an increased risk that was about 1 in 100 for cancer. 1 in 100 for cancer. The effects decreased dramatically just a few blocks away. Cancer can take decades to develop, and those who continued to follow the case awaited the results of a 30-year retrospective by the New York State Department of Health. When the study was finally released, the epidemiologist reported that the birth defect rate for children born to parents who had lived near the canal was higher than for Niagara County and the rest of the state, but they found no convincing evidence that life by the canal had given people cancer. The overall rate was actually a little lower than for the general population. Birth defects in cancer can both arise from mutation, so why would there be signs of one without the other? It seems plausible that the dividing cells of the developing embryo would be more sensitive to disruptive influences than cells in a fully grown person. And while a single mutation might be enough to derail a developmental pathway, several hits would usually be required for cells to become cancerous. But even after 3 decades, the The seeming head start provided by Love Canal hadn't been enough to produce an obvious excess in malignancies. Though largely disproven, Love Canal became a rallying point for environmental cleanup in the 1970s. Now we know that cancer is caused by complicated interaction where lifestyle is the major environmental impact on cancer cases. For example, research has repeatedly attributed about 30% of cancer to tobacco use. Obesity and lack of exercise are believed to account for about 20%, diet for 10 to 12%, alcohol for 4%, and viruses for 3%. Far down on the list are occupational exposure and pollutants. Because of Love Canal and other hazardous waste dumping, the Superfund was the first effort to respond to these national hazard waste problems. Superfund is the name given to the environmental program established to address abandoned hazardous waste sites. It's also the name of the fund established by the CERCLA, or Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act. This law was enacted in the wake of the discovery of toxic waste dumps such as Love Canal in the 1970s. It allows the EPA to clean up such sites and to compel responsible parties to perform cleanups or reimburse the government for EPA-led cleanups. In addition, there was a piece of legislation called Toxic Release Inventory, or TRIs, which has helped communities address the problem of hazardous materials. The TRI tracks the management of certain toxic chemicals that may pose a threat to human health and the environment. U.S. facilities in different industry sectors must report annually how much of each chemical is released into the environment and/or managed through recycling, energy recovery, and treatment. A quote-unquote release of a chemical means that it's emitted into the air or water or placed in some type of land disposal. You can go to the EPA TRI website, type in your area code, and see what wastes are inventoried in your community in Maine. Here's a map of Superfund sites in Maine. All of these sites are categorized as long-term national priorities or on the NPL list. The two that are blue have been closed down completely. Some sites, such as the Callahan Mine in Brooksville, are still listed as minimally contained and hazardous to people, while other sites, such as the Saco landfill, are labeled as contained. The Saco landfill Superfund site was designated primarily because there's an arsenic plume in the groundwater of up to 700 milligrams per liter. Regulation for drinking water is 10 milligrams per liter. This landfill was not a sanitary landfill, and the leachate easily moved down into the groundwater. Scientists showed here that dissolved organic carbon in the leachate plume was causing dissolution of arsenic from arsenic-containing iron oxides in the aquifer and bedrock below it. The dissolution occurred because the degradation of dissolved organic carbon in the plume removes oxygen from the water and created reducing conditions that favor the dissolution of iron oxides and the release of arsenic from the sediments. The landfill was capped in 1998 to reduce leachate into the ground. EPA considers this site under control. This is a typical example of what type of cleanup might be done in a localized area to solve a specific problem. Other sites, like the Callahan Mine, are much more difficult to clean up and hard to remediate. Historically, hazardous waste have been isolated from the environment in permanent disposal sites. New techniques for treating hazardous or toxic waste involve destruction or deactivation of damaging components, and these are very successful with carbon-based toxics, less successful with hazardous metals. Technologies include the plasma torch for incineration, solar radiation processing, and bioremediation, where bacteria are used to break down toxic organics. For the most part, though, things that contain heavy metals must be immobilized and stored in drums, or refined and reused. In this section, we talked about commonly accepted approach to waste treatment and how consumption reduction affects these common approaches. We also talked about closed versus open loops. We want to know when solid waste generation per person per day is in the U.S. How much of municipal solid waste by weight consists of yard and food waste? How much of this do we compost versus put in the landfill? What are the strategies to close the loop on municipal and industrial solid waste? What are some examples? What's CERCLA? What does it define? How is the Superfund related to CERCLA? What are the three major categories of hazardous waste? What is important about Love Canal historically as far as hazardous waste is concerned? And what is a TRI? Finally, what are examples of Superfund sites in Maine that are considered and contained and not contained?